The fate of this truly magnificent queen and talented ruler is tragic in its own way. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, was accused of state treason and eventually executed. Elizabeth was only 3 years old at the time. Rumor has it that Henry VIII wanted his wife to conceive a son, but, like his previous wife, Anne gave him a daughter. After Boleyn's execution, Elizabeth's father became engaged literally a single day later to his sweetheart, Jane Seymour. The king's new bride finally, a year later, pleased with a boy, Edward. Sadly, less than 2 weeks later, the woman died. The king subsequently married twice more, and while Henry VIII simply divorced Catherine Howard, his then next spouse was executed, as was Elizabeth's mother. From that moment on, the girl formed the opinion that a marriage with a man brought only misfortune. You're watching Flip Side of History, the other side of the known history. Today we will tell you about Queen Elizabeth I, the great Queen of England, and exactly why she was called a Virgin Queen. Now, let's get back to the story. As we were saying, adding to the negativity was the fact that after the king's death, his last wife, Catherine Parr, took Elizabeth into her care. Everything would have been fine if it had not been with Catherine's new husband, Thomas Seymour. The man clearly had his eye on the young girl, giving her implicit signs of attention. One of the governesses later recounted this. He would come many mornings to Lady Elizabeth's chambers. He wished her good morning, asked how she was doing, patted her on the back or buttocks in a friendly manner, and then went on about his business. But if Elizabeth was in her bed, the man would open the curtains and pretend to go to her. And then she would wrap herself even more tightly in the blanket, trying to avoid the man's gaze. To Catherine's credit, the woman was able to protect the girl from the advances of her husband, but these advances only added even more to Elizabeth's negative attitude toward the male gender in general and marriage in the first place. For the glory of God, for the good of the entire nation, I have decided to keep an indefeasible vow of virginity. Look at my ring of state. With it I am already engaged to my husband, to whom invariably I will be faithful to the grave. My husband is England, my children my countrymen. I will choose the most worthy man to be my husband, but until then I wish it to be engraved on my tomb. I lived and died a queen and a virgin. Despite this announcement, immediately after the coronation, Parliament began to push the Queen, demanding that Elizabeth should indeed marry. And here the Queen was faced with several unsolvable problems. On the one hand, to choose as husband one of the noble English families would automatically mean displeasing the others. After all, the king's family was elevated beyond all other families. And the second reason is this. Elizabeth remembered from her childhood that marriage to a man deprived her of independent power and sometimes posed many challenges, and that having children at all would immediately distract her from managing the affairs of her country. Therefore, not daring to refuse Parliament directly, Elizabeth found any reason to refuse the next applicant. In fact, even the infamous Ivan the Terrible had asked her to marry him. There is also a theory that in fact Elizabeth was in love with the representative of a noble aristocratic family, Robert Dudley. The young people had studied under the same mentor, Roger Ascham, when they were children. Elizabeth and Robert became even closer when they both ended up in the Tower of London. Elizabeth was taken there by order of Mary, who accused her half-sister of state treason, and Robert was imprisoned because of his father's schemes. Nevertheless, the young people could not marry lawfully. The fact is that Robert was already married at that time, and divorce was not encouraged in England. The right to marry was granted with a cross heart by the church only to the king. So Elizabeth made one of the most difficult decisions of her life. If there was no possibility of being together with her beloved, then there was no possibility of being with anyone on earth. It is unknown whether this is true or not. Some historians even claim that Elizabeth and Robert even had an illegitimate child, but no paper evidence of this has been found. However, the fact that the queen showered her beloved man with expensive gifts, money, and estates is a real proven fact. For this, incidentally at court, Robert was much disliked. The dislike became especially evident after Robert's official wife was discovered with a broken neck. Many thought that the young gentleman had purposely taken his wife's life in order to propose to Elizabeth. There are fairly conflicting opinions about the time of the Virgin Queen's reign. Some historians consider this era as one of the bloodiest, while others as the Golden Age of England. In terms of the state of government at the time, Elizabeth was an intelligent enough ruler. Her entourage believed, without all the flattery, that Elizabeth was one of the cleverest and most educated women of her time. The only downside to the Queen was her indecision, and there were even cases, for instance after issuing a decree, after which the next day she began to doubt whether it was right or wrong. Although such trivialities could also be put down to the peculiarities of a woman's nature. By the way, the fact that Elizabeth's reign would be a happy one for the English themselves, many realized even during the coronation. The future queen did not ride in a carriage, but demanded to be carried in a palanquin. This provided an opportunity for the royals not to run, but to walk beside her in a calm manner. At the crowning ceremony, the tradition of almsgiving to the poor was introduced. 5 pence was given to each person, and about £250 a year was spent on alms, which for that time was considered quite a lot of money. 30 almsgetters received alms at the royal palace each day, as the Queen had decreed. A gifted and intelligent politician, Elizabeth was able to strengthen England's position in the international arena and establish the foundations of England's dominance of the sea. Elizabeth was a patron of the arts and sciences. It was under her that William Shakespeare, Francis Bacon, and Christopher Marlowe worked. Ordinary Englishmen called Elizabeth the Good Queen. Yet many historians and biographers of the time have put forward a variety of occasionally surprising versions of the reasons for the Queen's celibacy. Some believed it was due to a physical handicap, which Elizabeth was ashamed of. Due to a case of dropsy, the lower part of Elizabeth's body was allegedly disproportionately bloated. However, there was no proof of this theory. Others were convinced that the Queen was in fact far from chaste and had more than one affair with her lovers, of whom there were many at court, and Elizabeth did not marry because she was simply an usurper and did not want to share her power and influence with anyone. But this is nothing more than just a speculation. At last, the most surprising is the version that Elizabeth was in fact not a woman, but a man. According to this hypothesis, it's exactly why she always wore a high collar that concealed her appendage, brought into fashion long gloves that could conceal the coarse male hands, and in general was habitually dressed in such a way that it was impossible to determine her gender outwardly. Advocates of this theory add permanent facial makeup, a wig, and a posthumous will in which the Queen asked that her body not be examined after death as evidence. But even this version is not documented either. The sole criticism of the Queen is the execution of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scotland. This, however, is not so much evidence of bloodthirstiness as of abnormal measures to prevent unrest. The fact is that Mary, Elizabeth's cousin, a seductive beauty, began to weave intrigues at the English palace, and some of her correspondence ended up in the hands of the Queen Elizabeth I. Mary's letters showed that she intended in all seriousness to overthrow the Virgin Queen and ascend the throne. Therefore, for the sake of national peace, the instigator of the revolt was executed. Until her demise, Elizabeth did not abandon her horse riding, reading books, and handling the governmental affairs. Anticipating her near death, the Virgin Queen announced an heir to the throne, who became King James I of Scotland, son of the executed Mary Stuart. This fact speaks of a great deal. It speaks of Elizabeth's truly wise leadership and of the fact that the scheming mother had no influence whatsoever on the fate of her own son, who, logically, could not be named heir to the throne. Elizabeth died at the age of 69 and was buried in Westminster Abbey. After the enthronement of James I, the remains of the executed Mary Stuart were reburied in the same royal crypt next to the tomb of Elizabeth I. Thank you for watching our video. Subscribe to Flip Side of History, leave a like and expect more videos from this channel.